Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. I'm here with Dr. Dan Patt, also a senior fellow at the Institute. And we're honored today to have with us Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts' 6th Congressional District, a former Marine. Congressman Moulton served 4 tours in Iraq, where he served as an infantry platoon leader, as well as being an advisor to General David Petraeus and working with senior Iraqi government officials during the time after the invasion of Iraq. Following his service in Iraq, Congressman Moulton left the service and went to Harvard Business School, where he graduated along with the Kennedy School of Government. And from there, he went on to be the managing director of Texas Central, which aims to be America's first high-speed rail line. Now in his 5th term in Congress, he is on the Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, which is relevant to our discussion here today, where he serves on the Cyber Innovation Technology and Information Systems Subcommittee, as well as on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. And he led the co-chaired the Future of Defense Task Force, which we'll talk a little bit about today. He also serves on the House Budget Committee and the House Transportation Committee. Thank you very much for being with us today, Congressman Moulton.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So just to lead off, I mean, obviously what's in the news right now is Ukraine and the war in Ukraine and progress there on the part of the Ukrainian army. Question is, Ukraine has been very successful of late in pushing Russia back and seems poised to potentially go further and make progress into potentially the areas of Ukraine that have been held by Russia for a long time, even before the beginning of this invasion. And a concern on the part of the administration and others is the potential for escalation if Ukrainians are able to go into Crimea or into the Donbass, which Russia has said are Russian territory, and that they'll respond accordingly. Do you think that this concern is well-founded? We need to be thinking about negotiated settlement to the operations in Ukraine, or do we need to think about maybe a different approach to try to bring this conflict to some kind of resolution?
Well, it's a great question, Bryan, and it's really central to the war effort. I mean, the administration is walking a fine line between helping the Ukrainians defeat Russia. I think we've learned by now that if we don't stop Putin here, he's going to go somewhere else next. We thought he might stop after Crimea. We thought he might stop after Georgia. Who knows what's next if he can eke out a win in Ukraine? But walking a line between defeating Russia, so that doesn't happen, and starting World War III, which is not unreasonable. I mean, the Russians have in their doctrine the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I've seen through exercises how quickly that can escalate into a full-on nuclear war. That is not fear-mongering or exaggeration to say that that is a risk literally for humanity. So I think the administration has actually done a remarkable job here. I was critical of the administration early on for not a sufficiently deterring conflict. I was critical of them for not supporting the Ukrainians quickly and robustly enough. But I do think this is an aspect of the conflict, arguably the most important aspect, that they've really handled quite well.
Those are great points. And I think one interesting aspect of this to think about is, what does this imply for other conflicts that the U.S. might find itself in, where it's supporting a third party dealing with a aggressive neighbor like Taiwan? So the concern with a Taiwan operation is always the escalation involved in having to strike mainland targets in China to be able to successfully defend Taiwan. Do you think we need to start thinking about the implications of Ukraine and the situation it has with regard to Russia in the context of Taiwan and China as well, and start gaming out plans where we maybe don't get that opportunity to strike the mainland?
Look, without question, and this was one of my first questions to Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley when they came before our committee for the first time since the war began. What lessons have we learned from Ukraine that are applicable to Taiwan? And I think there are a few that are worth running through real quickly. We've been able to kind of come, better late than never with a lot of supplies and armaments to Ukraine to get them to where they are today in the fight. We don't have that option with Taiwan. One of the first things China will do is blockade off the island. So we can't come in after the fact and supply them weapons. Everything they need for the fight, we have to have on the island to begin with. A second factor is the usefulness of the National Guard. Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience with civilians taking up arms. Many of them have been trained in the past or got quick training before the conflict. Taiwan's behind on developing a National Guard, but they are moving in the right direction, and they're, I think, just about to, if not already, have passed a law to extend National Guard training and service. So they recognize that this is an issue. The third lesson is the value of asymmetric weapons. You have $1,000 drones taking out $50 million tanks, and that's something that. And don't quote me on the exact price of a tank. I might have that wrong, but you get the point, which is that asymmetric capabilities are absolutely critical. I think Taiwan has a history of wanting very traditional capabilities, and we've got to make sure that they beef up on the asymmetric capabilities that are winning wars. Another aspect is intelligence sharing. We've helped Ukraine a lot by sharing intelligence, and the administration really did a remarkable job of sharing intelligence with the world to forecast what Russia was about to do and derail some of their false flag plans, where they wanted to do some sort of deception, blame it on the Ukrainians. Because we told people in advance that this was coming, the Russians were caught flat-footed. So these are a lot of important lessons that apply to Taiwan. But having said that, this is a very different fight. We're not going to see a case where 8 months into the war, America is supplying the Taiwans with the kind of continued weapons and ammunition that they need to continue the fight. We're not going to be able to just fight this through them. If China invades Taiwan and we honor our commitment to come to their defense, then a lot of Americans will die. And that's why it's so important that deterrence works in Taiwan. I think it's 1,000 times more important that deterrence succeeds in China-Taiwan than it was with Ukraine. One place where I do think there are a lot of parallels is in the fundamental motivations of the leaders, the two autocratic leaders of these nations, to do this in the first place. I think there are a lot of parallels between Putin's legacy-motivated ambitions with Ukraine and Xi's legacy-motivated ambitions with Taiwan. And that's why these situations are both dangerous. And one of the questions I sometimes get as a congressman is, what's the biggest story that nobody's talking about right now? I think the biggest, most dangerous story that nobody's talking about, never came up once in any of the midterm fights all across the nation, is China-Taiwan and the threat that is to world security.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into some more questions about some of the technology, because I think there's a great point you brought up about information and the role of information, both in managing a conflict, as we see with Ukraine today and the US's role in that, but also in trying to deter conflict and how we could better use the information environment. That's one thing we'll want to talk about. But before we get to that, what you talked about asymmetric capabilities and the lessons from Ukraine regarding the power that they have in terms of being able to defeat an enemy that's, coming at you and you're on the defensive. Do you think that there's lessons there for the U.S. and its modernization efforts? Because we've heard the Pentagon complaining they can't get things done quickly. They don't have a very long window before we might have to face a Taiwan contingency. Should the U.S. be looking at investing in these kind of asymmetric capabilities instead of hoping that Taiwan is?
Absolutely. And you see some services like the Marine Corps, and I think the Air Force as well, really leading the modernization effort. I think you see other services like the Navy and the Army really dragging their feet, not moving quickly enough. And this is something, I don't think any of the services are moving quickly enough. Congressman Gallagher and I wrote an op-ed as Marine veterans in Congress, defending the Commandant's push for modernization, his effort to get rid of tanks and artillery to make room for rockets and missiles and drones and things like this, all things that will make the frontline infantry platoon more lethal, more effective than it is today. But this is a fast-moving process. And while we defended the Commandant's efforts, our one criticism was he's actually not moving fast enough. And of course, you actually, on the other hand, have forces within the Pentagon and other services who are really dragging their feet on this. This is a huge risk. China is modernizing a lot faster than we are. In some respects, when we looked back, Russia was modernizing more quickly. It hasn't been as effective. But the point is that our adversaries are really moving out ahead of us, and we've got to catch up.
Yeah. In your Future of Defense Task Force report, one of the things you talked about is the need for new operational concepts for experimentation. There's an emphasis on battle networks. When we look at the Ukraine, one of the things that we see is, it's not just that there are low-cost drones there, and not just that there's intelligence sharing, that these things are networked together, right? We understand the Ukrainians are using tactical information sharing systems, but with each other, they're using these drones to populate targeting data with the aid of foreign weapons. They're using this for deep precision strikes. Like, it's remarkable how quickly this has come together. This is not battle networks that were rigorously designed over a decades-long process. There were not, rigorous requirements that were carefully vetted for this. What do you think the U.S. can learn from on the coordination, the requirements, the acquisition aspects of delivering effective battle networks from what we see in the Ukraine?
Great question. So, a few things. Speed is important in fielding these systems. Resiliency is key, but you don't get resiliency, to your point, just through the most sophisticated, battle-hardened, and, by the way, extremely expensive network. You get it by having redundancy. And that's what we've seen in Ukraine, where there are redundant systems. It makes it hard for Russia to take them all out at once. You obviously see tremendous integration of the commercial sector into this. Starlink is not a military system. It's a commercial system that the military has been able to use. So these are all important lessons that really fly in the face of traditional weapons development programs in the United States, where you have, decades to develop requirements and systems and test them. And by the time they get out to the field, that's a different story. I mean, I remember being in Iraq, where in the invasion, we had one Blue Force tracker for the entire battalion. And it was quite a thing when a few years later, I had one in my own Humvee. And of course, a Blue Force tracker is a moving map on a computer screen, which, that was, seemed pretty innovative in 2001. For anyone with a cell phone nowadays, that seems pretty pathetic. And when we wanted to update this Blue Force tracker, which obviously had been developed in the 80s and the 90s, we'd get out a 3.5-inch disc and spend a few hours downloading a new map. Whereas, how often do you get an update on your iPhone that just comes in when you're sleeping? So we're way behind in the military, and we've got to catch up. And we're not going to do that by just spending more money on defense and continuing to go through the same old tired acquisition process that we used to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles in the 1950s. We're going to do it by better integrating commercial technology, by moving faster, by being willing to break things, and by bringing in a much more diverse set of entrepreneurs and small companies and new companies and suppliers that can meet these needs and be competitive. That's what the rest of the world is doing, and we need to do it too.
Yeah, Congressman, that's a terrific point. And Dan and I have done research that's looking at that exact question. What's interesting is you brought up the idea of resilience, which is not about actually making things more survivable individually, but making the force more capable of continuing to operate despite being attacked or being degraded. And you talked about commercial systems. We need to think about accepting that commercial systems will not have the same features in terms of survivability or the same kinds of hardening that we would necessarily have in a traditional military system. Just accept the fact that we're going to be buying commercial systems that are an 80% solution, a 70% solution, but because of the combined effects of that redundancy, that you get a more resilient force in the end. Because it seems like that's where a lot of the people in DoD get hung up, is this desire for a more exquisite system that meets some very specific requirements rather than something that's got a more generalized resilience.
That's right. And the point is that it's a trade-off. It doesn't mean that there's never a place for nuclear hardening, for example. I mean, I would hope that our NC3 system to control our nuclear weapons has some real degree of hardening against nuclear blasts, right? But you've got to balance that, especially in a China-Taiwan scenario where we're trying to quickly get up to speed with the threat. You got to balance that with the time that it takes. The trade-off, you can spend 5 years, 10 years even designing a super hardened system that might actually be very hardened, but 10 years from now, it's also just completely out of date because technology moves so quickly.
Right. And you're not taking advantage of that
Yeah.
commercial innovation somebody else is paying for.
That's right.
Yeah. On that topic of commercial innovation, Congressman, an area you've been focused on is artificial intelligence and its incorporation into defense systems. Its progress here has been slow in the department. What have we learned? We learned that, well, machine learning, first of all, depends on access to data sets, and this really basic foundational problem is really hard, right? And it can be hard because of security. It can be because of outdated IT systems. It could be ownership struggles and parochialism. So while people maybe dream of these applications and everything from self-directing weapons to enhanced command and control systems, it feels like those visions we have for it are a long way from our current reality. And maybe that's not even talking about issues with trust, where AI tends to make surprising or counterintuitive recommendations. What do you see? It's been a couple of years since your report's been out. I know you've been tracking this issue carefully. What do you think DoD should be doing differently to pursue AI, to deliver new capability or better protect their forces?
One of the recommendations we made was quite specific. We were trying to look for ways to just force DoD to do this because they're clearly not. And one point was just, every new weapon system should have sort of an AI component or capability or an ability to integrate that, because the reality is that this is the future of warfare. And again, I think that we're starting to find ourselves behind. Look, I'm a Marine. We have a lot of proud Marine pilots, but the reality is that robots fly planes better in most cases. That's why every time you get on a commercial flight, I don't know, 90% of the flight is flown by a computer, not by the pilot. That's just the reality that we live with. I mean, we literally live with that in the commercial sector every single day, and yet there's this huge reluctance to adopt it in the military. So we have, we've spent ungodly amounts of money on the F-35, much of which is meant to, keep that pilot safe. And I'm not saying that there's never going to be a role for pilots in aircraft, but I think that if we were really looking at the future, we'd be developing a lot more pilot-less aircraft than aircraft that have to keep a pilot alive. Just to do their job. I mean, imagine how much you could increase the range of the F-35. You might actually be able to reach China with this weapon designed to fight China if you didn't have a pilot on board. But that's not the mindset of the military. They did some simulations where F-16. The best F-16 dogfighters were put against a computer. The computer won every time. And I heard a pilot make an excuse, say, well, the thing is that the turns that these computers were taking, they would probably, the G-forces would be so great that they'd probably knock a pilot out. Well, first of all, that's just patently not true, because obviously a constraint that they put on the model is to not have G-forces too great for the pilot. But an even better model would not have that restriction, because it would not have a pilot flying the plane. So no matter how you look at it, the AI wins, and we've got to come to terms with that and recognize that as a military. So there's a lot more to be said about this, but I want to make one point that I think is especially crucial here, which is that there's this whole other dimension to the AI discussion, which revolves around the ethics of AI, not just trusting AI. That's what we were just talking about. Do pilots trust that AI can fly an airplane? The ethics of AI, of course, govern how it's used. And this is a place where we're very, very far behind. Coming out of World War II, when we developed the first nuclear bomb, there was a tremendous concerted international effort, in many cases led by the very scientists who developed these weapons, to constrain their use, to prevent nuclear proliferation, to establish international norms, conventions, and treaties to limit the use of nuclear weapons. It's a regime that's been remarkably effective. There hasn't been a nuclear weapon used since 1945. Well, there is no effort whatsoever in that department with regards to AI. And I would argue that AI-enabled weapon systems may ultimately be even more dangerous than nuclear weapons. And they're certainly headed in that trajectory if we don't have any constraints around their use. If we do not lead this effort, if we are not the ones who fundamentally set the ground rules agreed to by international treaty for the use and development of AI-enabled weapons, and we leave that to adversaries like China, then we're going to lose, because China doesn't care about civilian casualties. They don't care as much as we do about collateral damage. And so therefore, if it's a free-for-all, we are going to have more restraint on our weapon systems, more restraints than they will on theirs, and theirs will therefore probably be more lethal. So I think it's a national security imperative, not just a human imperative or an ethical imperative, that we have a major effort to establish the rules around the use and development of AI. And we're really doing next to nothing in that department. So this is a big effort of mine. This is something that I am pursuing. I had a long conversation with an AI expert in the private sector about how we can involve the private commercial sector in the development of this ethical framework. And I'm going to be pursuing that among some of my other priorities over the next Congress.
Yeah. Congressman, so just so I understand that point, let me dive into that. So you're suggesting that this isn't just about the more effective weapon, that this is really about the international norm setting, the standards, the acceptance, establishing the moral high ground that the U.S. should try to occupy. Is that right?
That's right. And and look, I think you can win this argument by simply saying that, AI weapons could take over the world. That's not a crazy science fiction future. That might be in 50 or 100 years that we get to that point. And so literally for the survival of humanity, we should have these rules, just like for the survival of humanity, we have agreements and restrictions around the use of nuclear weapons. But there is this other dimension, which I think is more immediate, which is that we want these rules to work in our favor. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty has been oft criticized because hawks think that this really limited our development of these weapons that now some of our adversaries have. Of course, China has developed these; they're outside the treaty. Russia has developed them in spite of the treaty. But for a very, very long time, having this treaty not only limited the overall number of weapons in the world, which makes us all safer, but it actually gave us a great advantage, because Russia had ground-based intermediate range weapons that were scrapped because of the treaty. We had submarine-based weapons that could fill that gap that Russia really didn't have. So essentially, the treaty made everybody a little bit safer, but it also gave us a strategic advantage. And that's how we should think about these things. Even though I think, like I said, you could probably win the argument that this is necessary purely on the ethics.
Right. So a question on that, Congressman, is one of the areas we've been looking at is the role of humans in automated weapon systems operations. So the role of human and machines working together to do command and control, for example, to build courses of action. The role of humans in helping weapons determine whether they're going after the right target or not, or make that decision as they're approaching the target. And the fact that, oftentimes you get better performance if there's a human and machine working together rather than having the machine try to do this entirely by itself. And what we found in some of the research is, AI-enabled systems this effect is exacerbated, right? So an AI-enabled weapon can be fooled into pursuing the wrong target or pursuing an ineffective course of action if you don't have a human in there to act as a check on it. Is that a way to go?
Humans can be fooled too, but
humans can be fooled as well. But you'd hope that, and what we've looked at is the idea that, well, between the human and the machine, maybe they're not both being fooled simultaneously. But of course, that could happen as well. The idea, though, that maybe, an ethical framework that forces humans to be involved in decisions that AI-enabled systems are making, that may, be able to enforce more ethical behavior, but it may also make us more effective. Do you think that's a path we may go on? Because I think one argument people will make is, well, why would we unilaterally disarm when China will probably not follow these rules anyway? It seems like maybe there's another path which says this is actually a more effective way to use these systems.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that right now that's probably the case. And there's certainly examples throughout history of when humans have corrected systems. There was a famous example in the 1980s where all the Russian systems said that a massive incoming nuclear strike was coming, and one Russian major, I think at the time, completely disobeyed orders and said no, he didn't think that was what's going on. And we're probably having this conversation today because of that Russian general, or Russian major. So So yes, there are a lot of examples of where this is the case, but I think that, as these systems are developed, we'll find out that there are some things where you probably don't want a human involved. A defensive, an anti-missile defense on a ship that's supposed to take out an incoming anti-ship missile, like that has to happen so quickly. You probably just want the computer running that. But then there are a lot of other places where together, working with computers, humans, and AI together can make better decisions.
Right.
Yeah, but back on the technology side for just a minute. Frameworks aside, it feels like there's so much progress to be made here. I mean, you've recently taken the department to task on its challenges in agile acquisition, in effective innovation, and especially around this theme of commercial technologies, software, which they feel like the underpinnings of what you point out to be so much of modern military capability. I know you've pursued legislative initiatives in the past couple of years. Like, is this something that you still plan to pursue? Is this also a priority for you?
Oh, no.
And do you have some specific ideas of new things that maybe, or what else can the DoD be doing to better leverage the commercial sector?
If we were to go through the list, it would take another couple hours. So I won't try to do that. But let me just emphasize once again, we're really behind here. We're really behind. So we released the Future Defense Task Force report a couple years ago. We just more recently released a report card where we track the progress on different initiatives, what's moving ahead, what's not. But through all of this, it's not just working on these problems, it's solving them quickly. Time really is of the essence. Time is especially of the essence when it comes to deterring a conflict with China over Taiwan. We've got to prove to Xi Jinping and the Chinese military that we're going to stop them in their tracks. And we've got to prove that to them before they decide to invade. Having all the capabilities we need to deter China ready to go by 2032 is probably too late. And so speed really matters. So this is, really fundamentally, my number one focus on the House Armed Services Committee is improving modernization and innovation, supporting the services when they're doing the right thing, like the Marine Corps, but driving the services, all of them, to do more and to do more quickly.
So on that note, one of the challenges the services have, especially like the Army and the Navy, where they've got a lot of force structure that they currently have oriented around maybe one way of fighting. It's going to be very difficult for them to build their forces up rapidly or change them over very quickly. The Marine Corps has a little bit easier time of that, I think, because it can be more agile and it's smaller. What are some of the ways that we can get more out of the force we have? It sounds like, one idea is we need to start incorporating asymmetric commercial technologies that are probably faster to acquire than traditional military systems. Are we looking at, is JADC2 or the ability to recompose forces into new and more innovative ways and more creative ways? Is that part of it? Or what are the ways that we can take the force we have and better employ it?
Let me just start with the premise of your question, which is that the Marine Corps has an advantage in agility. The Army and the Navy are slower to change. You don't get to use that excuse with China.
Mm-hmm.
If China invades and our army's not ready, you don't get to say, well, that's not really fair because our army's big and hard to change. That's ridiculous. If the army's too big, maybe we need to cut it down. Mm-hmm. If the Navy's too slow to change, then we need better leaders at the Navy. I mean, these are just absolutely not acceptable excuses. So regardless of what the particular system is, we've got to make sure that all of our services are modernizing quickly enough to meet the threat. The Army and the Navy are not. I mean, I would argue again that the Marine Corps isn't even moving quickly enough, right, but they're moving a hell of a lot faster than the Army and the Navy. The Army and the Navy have no excuses. They've got to meet the threat. Doesn't matter what their history is, their past, or their force structure. So that's the first point that I think is absolutely critical to make. We used to talk about how China has this 1 million-man army. But the 1 million-man army is actually kind of a handicap because they have so many people. They're actually very poorly trained. It takes a lot of money and resources to support this 1 million-man army. Well, guess what? China recognized that problem, and they changed their force structure dramatically. They changed their investment structure dramatically. They don't spend a ton of money just supporting a bunch of conscripted troops. They're investing in missiles that kill aircraft carriers, which, by the way, cost about, I don't know, 1/1250th the cost of an aircraft carrier. So they get 1,250 shots for one aircraft carrier. That's not math that works well for us. So I just have no patience with the Army and the Navy and their excuses here. They've got to rapidly modernize, and if that means cutting force structure so that they can afford other things, well, guess what? That's exactly what the Marine Corps is doing.
Right.
They ought to follow suit. They ought to follow suit.
So to pull on that a little bit, one thing the Navy has been trying to do is divest of a lot of existing force structure to try to free up the money and the people to be able to devote to new capabilities. But they've been very slow to invest in those new capabilities. So they've been shedding or wanting to shed ships, and they maybe haven't been successful in doing that. But they've been really slow in fielding the new unmanned systems, the new smaller ships that they've been trying to replace them with to get this more distributed, more recomposable force, I guess. Can Congress help spur the Navy and the Army in this case to buy the new things they need to buy more quickly? Because it seems like they're okay with shedding the old stuff, but they are terrible at buying the new stuff.
Well, I think it's a bit of a balance. And yes, Congress can do more to encourage this. Congress can also just not get in the way. And let's be honest, there have been many times when it's been Congress that has held up this modernization because we insist on holding on to the old things. And that's usually for local domestic politics, and that's wrong. And as a freshman, I think I had a big debate during the NDA markup about whether or not we should go against the wishes of the Air Force and force them to retain A-10s. And everybody loves A-10s. I get it. A-10s supported me in Iraq. I also saw A-10s kill a bunch of Marines. Not literally there, but my first sergeant was there. So they're far from perfect. But here's the point. The Air Force actually wanted to modernize, put that money into future systems that we need to fight China. Congress held them back. And some people came to me afterwards and said, well, Seth, this was easy for you to carry the water. But, the person on the other side had a lot of A-10 equities. The person who had the amendment to force the Air Force to hang on to the A-10s just happened to represent the largest A-10 base in the world, just happened to have the closest congressional race in the country, and just happened to be an A-10 pilot herself. But it's our job as members of Congress looking out for our national security to step away from those selfish equities and do the right thing for the country. And as it happened, the new engines for the A-10 that would be bought as a part of this amendment are made at the largest factory, the largest employer, in the toughest city in my district. But I accepted the responsibility in carrying the water for this amendment, literally, risking taking away jobs from my aircraft engine plant. I said, this is the right thing for our national security. It's my responsibility to do the right thing for our national security and then go back to Lynn, Massachusetts and explain to the workers at that plant why we had to make this tough decision. That's what we need to see more of from Congress as well. But on the spurring innovations, we're constantly talking about acquisition reform. There's a joke that if we could just get China, instead of stealing F-35 plans, to steal our federal acquisition requirements and start following those, then we'd actually win this race. We clearly need to dramatically change the FAR, the federal acquisition requirements. Right. But before we can get there, we probably just need to double down on programs within DoD that are working well. And that's why you see a lot of members of Congress fighting for funding for programs like the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, because look, none of these groups is perfect, but they have proven time and again that they can field equipment and capabilities more quickly than the traditional acquisition system.
Right. And the traditional acquisition system seems to have a very tough time with new systems like unmanned systems, where the requirements probably not well defined in advance, and they're having to do some kind of iterative process of development and work with the operator.
Exactly right.
It's challenging for them to think through, because arguably there's enough authorities out there for them to do these acquisition processes more quickly. It's just they fail to be able to execute because they just are incapable of getting out of that traditional mindset.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty in the weeds point, but you're absolutely right. That's actually one of the things we determined on our future defense task force, that a lot of the things that we wanted the services to do It didn't actually require new authorities from Congress, because Congress actually already provided those authorities. The services aren't taking advantage of them. I'll give you an example outside of the acquisition process. Several years ago, we gave the authorities to the services to change their promotion system, to take experts in and just bring them in at higher ranks. That kind of flexibility is clearly something that we need to hire and retain the kinds of talented personnel that are needed to man these sophisticated new weapon systems. We're competing for cyber warriors against all the private sector cyber companies like Apple and Google and all the and you know, Microsoft and all the companies that actually focus on cyber in particular. And it turns out that we actually have given the services those authorities, but they haven't used them.
Right. Yeah, which is pretty relevant today, considering the services are talking about recruiting and retention challenges, being able to meet their not only their quotas for recruiting, but just to keep people in the service when there's other opportunities elsewhere. And I guess it goes also back to your point about commercial. So is a way that DoD could maybe help fill this gap in terms of technical expertise, leveraging commercial providers for services in cases where it would have previously been something the government did itself, but maybe we need to shift that to a commercial provider that we can have, you know, building the software that puts together a force package downrange, as opposed to doing that upfront in the acquisition process.
Yes, I mean, the quick answer is yes. We definitely need to do that. Leveraging commercial suppliers is another way to say contracting out, which is not always what we want to do. I mean, I think that the degree to which, for example, we have contracted out security, we have a lot more military contractors doing the jobs of our troops, is not fundamentally healthy for our democracy or effective for our national security in the long run. So I think there are places where we've got to be careful about this. I don't think that having an army of contractors, essentially a mercenary army fighting our wars, is where we want to get, because when the going gets tough, they're going to be looking at their paycheck rather than their values as to why they're there, and that's not going to be an effective fighting force. Right. But there are places where we absolutely need to be more flexible with this, and that's really the point. And I think if you look back to you know, to a conflict like World War II, where we look at sometimes sort of, it seems like the America really came together as best we can. Certainly there are a lot of places where we've leveraged the commercial sector. We had entire commercial factories just turned over to military production, and they weren't run by soldiers or Marines. They were run by civilians. And you also, by the way, had much more flexible promotions. There are a lot of lessons, ironically, that we can still use from World War II, I think.
Just really briefly on that point, you know, I do think that's such an interesting period in time. And, you know, one of the lessons that I learned about, you know, World War II mobilization is, you know, you grew up in Michigan near you know, the Willow Run bomber plant, that while it was a commercial plant and commercially run, like the designs for the aircraft didn't come from Ford Motor Company. No, there was a defense industry doing that, right? That industrial mobilization represented this really interesting union of commercial capability. And there, at this period in America's history, right, it was about mass production. It was about being able to, you know, repeatably manufacture at scale, you know, marrying up that unique commercial capability with defense capability. And the government orchestrated that. And
That's
I do wonder if our challenge today isn't similar. Except now our economic driver is in information technologies. It is, you know, it's expressed in data and software and AI. And, you know, we need to leverage those commercial talents together with the national security specific applications.
That's absolutely right. And the integration piece is key. I think going into the Future Defense Task Force report, there were some people, and this tends to be, not to break this down by ideology, but it's sort of an interesting debate. There tend to be more conservatives who say we just need to use the commercial sector, and then the more liberal position is usually we need to give the government money. A place where you really see this applicable is in research budgets. A lot of times, it's Democrats who are defending the money for basic scientific research at universities, whereas Republicans are saying, hey, we don't need that. The commercial sector is developing things more quickly. And the overwhelming bipartisan conclusion of the Future Defense Task Force was that we absolutely need both. that there are places where we should be leveraging the commercial sector way more. But the commercial sector gets a lot of their basic technology from the basic research science that's done by universities that they're never going to support because it's too risky. And you need government funding for that as well. But when you get to the mobilization piece, as you were saying, Dan, a lot of this is about integration. It's about using the talents of the defense industry and leveraging them more broadly with all the resources and the innovation of the broader commercial sector. And you know who's doing this really well? China. China's doing it really well. And they have some advantages because if you're a company in China and the government says jump, you're going to jump. And we don't want that system fundamentally, but we've got to recognize that that's our competition. That's our threat right now. And if we're not integrated as well as they are, we've got to realize that we're going to have to do better if we want to win this race.
Yep.
Well, I think that's a terrific point to end on, Congressman Moulton. That's really the heart of the discussion we were trying to have, is this idea of how do we better leverage the commercial sector to innovate in the Department of Defense and improve our military and modernize. So thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for being with us and giving us your insights.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We appreciate Congressman Moulton being here, and also thank you, David Altman, for producing this. And from the Hudson Institute, I'm Bryan Clark. Have a great day.